Case 1. Reverend Timothy Wright. The highway outside Port Chester, New York, was calm and ordinary on the night of July 4, 2008, when Reverend Timothy Wright sat behind the wheel driving his family home from a church conference. They had spent the day doing what he loved most: worship services, fellowship, and planning future ministry work. It was supposed to be an easy trip back, one of those quiet, late-night drives where the roads are mostly empty, but without warning, everything changed. A wrong-ways vehicle appeared ahead, moving directly toward them. The collision that followed left the gospel world stunned. Wright's wife, Betty, and his grandson did not survive the impact. Wright himself was rushed to the hospital with critical injuries. For decades, he had been known as the godfather of gospel, a choir leader, songwriter, and pastor whose music played in Sunday services across America. Now the same community that sang his songs would spend months praying for a miracle that never came. Timothy Wright had lived a life steeped in ministry long before that tragic night. Born and raised in Brooklyn, he built his reputation in choirs and church groups throughout the 1970s and 1980s, becoming a respected voice in gospel music. His songs carried messages of perseverance, worship, and spiritual endurance. Many described him as the kind of leader who made people believe they could get through anything. He never pretended to be a superstar. He was a working pastor, a choir director, and a family man who spent as much time with congregations as he did on recordings. That authenticity made his music feel personal for millions of listeners who later struggled to believe the headlines about the crash were real. In the weeks following the accident, gospel fans watched updates from his hospital room like a prayer vigil. Churches across the country held special services, singing his songs and asking for recovery. News stations reported cautiously. Wright was strong, resilient, and hopeful, but complications were severe. He underwent surgeries and months of treatment, fighting through pain that most people never knew existed. Even while bedridden, church members said he continued to speak about hope, faith, and God's timing, but ultimately the injuries were too much. In April 2009, nearly 9 months after the crash, Rev. Timothy Wright passed away. What began as a long holiday weekend ended as one of gospel music's darkest seasons. His death left unanswered questions, unresolved grief, and an unmistakable mark on gospel history. Pastors called it a reminder of how fragile life can be. Choir directors dedicated performances to him. For people who grew up hearing his voice, to find an era of praise, it felt impossible that he was gone. Every July, social media posts still appear remembering where they were when they heard the news. His songs remain on Sunday playlists, his influence still heard in choirs that never met him. And for those who knew him personally, the location of his final journey, a highway after a church event, became a symbol of a life that never stopped moving toward ministry. Welcome to Savage Case Files, the channel where real stories, real tragedies, and real investigations are told with respect, depth, and honesty. If you're drawn to documentaries like this one, where we go inside the moment everything changed and uncover the truth behind the headlines, then take a second right now to subscribe. Your support genuinely matters. Every click, every comment, every new subscriber keeps us motivated to research, write, and release high-quality, true storytelling every single day. We don't just cover scandals, we honor legacies, tell the truth, and preserve history one case at a time. So if you believe these lives, these voices, and these stories deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button. It costs nothing, but it means everything to us. Now let's move to the next case. Case 2, Dottie Rambo. Just after sunrise on May 11, 2008, a tour bus rolled along Interstate 44 toward Missouri. Inside, gospel legend Dottie Rambo was surrounded by her closest friends and musicians, reviewing notes for that day's Mother's Day concerts. She had sung through pain before, back issues, surgeries, sleepless nights, but no amount of physical struggle ever stopped her from showing up where she believed God had called her. For 6 decades, she had written the soundtrack to modern gospel, songs that healed, comforted, and guided millions through storms of every shape. On that quiet Sunday morning, she had no reason to believe the road ahead would be any different. Her life was one long journey from church to church, stage to stage, microphone to microphone. And then, in seconds, everything changed. The sky turned dark and rain hammered the highway. Drivers later recalled a sudden storm rolling over that stretch of road, turning asphalt slick and visibility near zero. Without warning, the bus lost control. Tires skidded, bodies lurched, metal screamed against concrete. Passengers would later describe the moment as violent and instant. No time to brace, no time to pray. When the bus finally stopped, shattered windows and twisted steel were all that remained. Dottie Rambo, the woman who had written "He looked beyond my fault and saw my need," lay critically injured among the wreckage. Paramedics arrived within minutes. State troopers closed the highway and rushed the survivors to hospitals in Springfield. News traveled fast. Within hours, gospel radio stations interrupted programming to report that Dottie Rambo had been in a serious bus accident. Messages poured in from pastors, fans, and fellow artists. Then came the headline no one wanted to see. Dottie Rambo had died from the injuries sustained in the crash. The Mother's Day concert she was traveling to became memorial gatherings instead, full of tears, disbelief, and stories of how her songs had carried people through grief, doubt, and heartbreak. Her death hit the gospel industry like a shockwave. Dottie wasn't just a singer, she was a cornerstone. More than 2,500 songs, a voice that transcended genres. Awards from the Grammys, Dove Awards, and Gospel Music Hall of Fame. Everyone from Elvis Presley to Whitney Houston had recorded her songs. She was the woman who made congregations quiet their hearts, and worship leaders closed their eyes when they needed words they couldn't articulate themselves. Now, without warning, she was gone, taken not by illness, scandal, or age, but by a simple stretch of rain-slicked highway. In the days following, tributes flooded in. Artists recorded impromptu covers of her classics. Churches dedicated Sunday services to her memory. TV specials rolled footage from decades of concerts, reminding viewers of the small woman with the big voice who never toned down her message to fit a market. Fans shared stories of being healed, comforted, or restored by her music at moments when life was too heavy to carry alone. Gospel historians later called her loss a turning of the page, marking the end of an era when touring legends built their ministries church by church, city by city, handwritten lyrics in notebooks, guitars in overhead racks, and prayer before every stop. For a woman who spent her entire life on the road, there was something hauntingly poetic about her final moments being spent that way. Still traveling, still ministering, still on mission. Dottie Rambo didn't die retired or forgotten. She died doing exactly what she had always done, bringing gospel music to people who needed hope. But on that interstate in Missouri, the ministry ended abruptly, forcing everyone left behind to consider a question that would echo through the gospel community for years. How can someone so essential, so steady, disappear in a single moment on a Sunday morning highway? Case 3, James Cleveland. James Cleveland spent his final days in Los Angeles surrounded by family, sunlight pouring through the windows of a quiet home that had once been full of rehearsals, late-night music sessions, and visiting choir directors from across the nation. He had been called many things over the course of his career: the King of Gospel, the architect of modern gospel, the man who took church music from wooden pews to national stages. But no one expected his voice to fall silent as suddenly as it did. On February 9, 1991, at just 59 years old, Cleveland died from heart failure and complications related to his health, a moment that marked the end of an era for gospel and the start of one of the genre's most complicated legacies. To understand the weight of that day, you have to know who James Cleveland was when he was still breathing. A composer, arranger, and choir leader whose fingerprints are on almost every corner of gospel music in the late 20th century. He transformed choir singing by blending classical arrangements with full-throated church fire, training community choirs to sound like symphonies. He founded the Gospel Music Workshop of America, a national institution that mentored thousands. And he wasn't just a performer, he was a teacher, a musical visionary. Countless now-famous gospel artists trace their beginnings back to James Cleveland's influence. And that's in some of the most crowded acts. But on that February morning, legacy couldn't hold back the inevitable. Cleveland's health had been worsening for years, and close friends noticed his energy fading even though he continued recording. He'd still smile through rehearsals, still call out instructions, still take his place at the piano, but the stamina that once drove marathon recording sessions was disappearing. In the days leading up to his passing, the home took on a noticeably reverent tone. Friends recall nurses moving quietly through hallways while handwritten lyrics and sheet music lay untouched on the dining table. It was as if music itself was waiting, watching, preparing to say goodbye. Heart failure doesn't announce its exact hour. There's no countdown, no dramatic crescendo, just sudden finality. When James Cleveland died, the call rippled instantly through Los Angeles, then Chicago, Detroit, New York, every place where choirs practiced his songs. Radio stations paused regular broadcasts to remember him. Pastors rewrote Sunday sermons. Choir directors gathered their singers for spontaneous memorials. It wasn't just the loss of a man. It was the loss of a musical movement's heartbeat. His death brought questions and painful public scrutiny. Rumors and controversy followed, the kind that complicate a legacy and unsettle fans who only knew the music, not the man. But even those conversations couldn't erase the national mourning that swept through black churches that week. Funerals and tributes lasted for days, and hundreds of choirs performed the very songs he wrote. God is, give me a clean heart, where is your faith, as if singing them could summon him back. The thing about James Cleveland is that where he was when it happened wasn't a dramatic public spectacle or a tragic accident. He didn't die on stage, on a highway, or in a plane crash. He died in the safety of a home full of memories, a quiet room where music once lived loudly. And that's what makes his story different. His tragedy wasn't the shock of sudden disaster, it was the aching silence that followed. Even now, decades later, when choirs launch into a James Cleveland arrangement, something in the room shifts. The soul of gospel remembers. And someone always says the same quiet line, as if repeating a truth that never loses its weight. The King of Gospel's voice fell silent too soon. Case 4. Thomas Whitfield. Thomas Whitfield's death came without warning, a quiet exit that stunned a community accustomed to seeing him command choirs with supernatural precision. He was at home in Detroit on November 21, 1992, a day like any other, resting in a city where he had written, arranged, and produced some of the greatest choir music ever recorded. Then, without a single public health crisis reported, without drama or spectacle, he suffered sudden respiratory failure. There were no ambulances racing down a highway, no breaking news bulletins interrupting gospel radio, just a call that spread first among close friends, then choir members, and finally across the nation. Thomas Whitfield was gone. Before tragedy struck, Whitfield was widely respected as one of the most innovative arrangers in modern gospel. He wasn't just a singer, he was the architect behind a sound that blended classical sensibilities with Pentecostal fire. In Detroit's church basement studios, he shaped harmonies nobody else dared to attempt and raised a generation of musicians who watched him stack vocals line by line until the choir became a living instrument. When he was at the piano, people said it was like watching someone build a cathedral out of sound. Each chord precise, reverent, and soaring. Those who worked closest to him saw a relentless perfectionist who drove sessions late into the night. Fans around the world heard nothing but the effortless beauty that came out of it. That's what made his passing feel unreal. This wasn't someone people expected to lose young, and there was no long goodbye or dramatic medical fight to prepare anyone. His music was still climbing radio charts. Choirs still sang his arrangements every Sunday. He had recently been outlining new work, the kind of ambitious projects only Whitfield could pull off. When the news broke that he had died at home, the gospel world experienced a collective gasp. A moment of silence followed by stunned phone calls and tearful conversations in choir rehearsals, from Detroit to Newark to Los Angeles. In the days that followed, tributes poured in. Choir directors gathered their singers to rehearse Whitfield classics, and many did so through tears. Radio stations played nothing but the blood. "We Need a Word from the Lord," and "I'm Encouraged," not as nostalgia pieces, but as urgent reminders of what one man gave to gospel music in such a short time. Those who knew him personally spoke gently about his legacy, describing a man who could compose entire songs in his head before ever touching a keyboard. Someone who heard choirs as if they were already fully assembled. The emotional weight of Whitfield's sudden death rested in its simplicity. There was no scandal, no mask ripped off, no hidden story waiting to be exposed. It was loss, pure and devastating, the kind that reminds people how fragile even the brightest creative flame can be. One day he was arranging music, the next day his hands, which had shaped the future of gospel sound, were still. Today, Thomas Whitfield's name remains sacred among musicians. Younger choirs perform his work without realizing just how revolutionary his techniques once were. Older singers remember the sessions, the rehearsals, the standard he set that most never reached. The tragedy of his story is not controversy or downfall, but the abruptness with which greatness can leave the world. Whitfield died quietly at home, and in that moment the Motor City lost one of its most important voices, a maestro whose absence is still felt every time a gospel choir tries to reach the level of musical excellence he set without ever saying a word. Case 5. LaShun Pace. She was one of those gospel voices you never forget, a raw cry wrapped in melody, a sound that could shatter despair and lift entire congregations to their feet. LaShun Pace, known for hits like "I Know I've Been Changed" and her unforgettable work with the Anointed Pace Sisters, had a voice that felt bigger than life. But when she entered the hospital in Atlanta for what seemed like yet another medical visit, no one imagined it would be the last time the world would hear from her. The truth is, LaShun had been battling a long list of health challenges for years, many of them hidden behind the microphone, the church pews, and the stage lights. She never dramatized her pain, she never centered her suffering, she just kept singing until her body simply couldn't fight anymore. When news broke on March 21, 2022, that LaShun Pace had passed away, gospel fans across the world were immediately struck by a painful irony. One of the strongest voices in gospel had been carrying some of the quietest struggles. Family members confirmed complications from kidney issues, and though reporters tried to piece together timelines and medical details, the reality was simple. This icon had quietly endured far more physical hardship than the public ever realized. For many, her death didn't read like a sudden tragedy, but rather a deeply sad conclusion to a long, difficult journey marked by resilience, faith, and relentless ministry. Her story is inseparable from gospel history. LaShun grew up singing in Atlanta sanctuaries, eventually rising to national fame in the 1990s. Her recordings were marked by conviction and something that can't be taught, authenticity born from lived experience. But tragedy visited her long before her passing. In 2007, she buried her teenage daughter, Zania, a heartbreak that permanently altered her spirit. Health challenges followed, significant weight fluctuations, organ issues, and repeated hospital stays. Still, LaShun never stepped away from ministry. She kept recording, preaching, and performing, even if that meant doing so while physically exhausted and battling a body that felt like it was betraying her. Where she was when it happened wasn't some dramatic moment in the public eye. It was painfully ordinary. A hospital room, machines humming, nurses moving quietly, family praying. A woman who had shouted thousands of songs of victory suddenly facing a final moment where no stage lights or applause could soften reality. And in a sense, that is what makes her story so devastating. She didn't die in a crash, a sudden collapse, or a headline-making incident. She died in the same quiet way so many people with chronic illness do, after years of fighting battles most never saw. The aftermath was immediate and emotional. Gospel artists posted tributes across social media. Radio stations ran memorial sets of her music. Church choirs rehearsed her powerful runs in her honor. Fans shared testimonies of how her voice carried them through grief, depression, and spiritual crisis. Her legacy became a national conversation not just about talent but endurance, about a woman who gave everything she had to a genre that often takes more from its artists than it gives back. And that's the haunting truth about LaShun Pace's death. It exposed the cost of being a vessel. A reminder that behind every powerful voice in gospel music, there is a person with blood, tissue, exhaustion, and frailty. She died in an Atlanta hospital bed, but her music, her unmistakable cry of faith, continues to move through churches, car speakers, and anyone who ever needed a reminder that praise can rise even out of suffering. Case 6. Andraé Crouch. He spent nearly 5 decades shaping the sound of modern gospel, but when the end came for Andraé Crouch, it happened in a quiet Los Angeles hospital room, 2 days after his twin sister, Sandra, passed away. For millions of believers and musicians around the world, the news felt like losing 2 pillars at once. Andraé had always been a force of renewal. In the 1970s and 80s, he pulled gospel out of traditional pews and pushed it into mainstream recording studios, blending worship with pop sensibilities that caught the ear of legends. Michael Jackson wanted André's choirs, Madonna wanted his tone, Quincy Jones wanted his arrangements. He wrote Soon and Very Soon, The Blood Will Never Lose Its Power, and My Tribute, songs that became eternal fixtures in church hymnals. Yet by the winter of 2015, the man who had carried gospel around the world was struggling just to breathe. In the final week of his life, Andraé was in and out of the hospital with serious pneumonia complications. This wasn't a sudden tragedy like a car crash or a mysterious collapse on stage. It was a long, steady decline that his closest friends tried to hide from the public. He had already been dealing with significant health issues that slowed his touring schedule and limited his appearances. To those around him, there was a heartbreaking irony in how illness dimmed the voice that once elevated entire arenas. Fans were unaware of the severity. They expected another comeback. After all, Andraé had reinvented gospel music multiple times. Why wouldn't he return one more time? But on January 8, 2015, all the prayers, phone calls, and hopeful waiting reached a quiet end. Before dawn, Andraé Crouch slipped away, exactly 48 hours after saying goodbye to his twin sister. For people who grew up on his music, it was almost too much to comprehend. 2 funerals, 1 family, 1 week. It was as if an entire chapter of gospel history closed in less than 72 hours. Churches across America held services dedicated to his memory. Radio stations played his classics non-stop. Online tributes poured in from names that span generations and genres. Kirk Franklin, CeCe Winans, Snoop Dogg. Everyone had a story about how Andraé changed what they believed gospel could sound like. Where he was when it happened mattered. He wasn't isolated or forgotten. He passed in the same city where so much of his musical influence spread, surrounded by the people who protected his legacy. And in that moment, gospel music realized what it had lost. Not just a singer, but an architect. A man who showed that worship could live on mainstream stages without losing its soul. Even today, when choirs soar behind pop artists, or when a Sunday morning anthem crosses over into the charts, you can hear echoes of a sound Andre pioneered decades ago. His death didn't spark controversy or prolonged debate, just the heavy grief that comes when someone truly irreplaceable leaves the earth. But make no mistake, his passing was tragic in its timing, in its double shock, and in the realization that the soundtrack of countless lives suddenly had a silence where a voice used to be. Even now, years later, gospel artists still return to one sentence when trying to explain what he meant to them. To God be the glory, and they say it in his melody. Case 7. Terrell Kibble. It was an ordinary day inside a Nashville home, the kind of day where nothing seems urgent, nothing feels threatening, and life moves along in those quiet domestic rhythms that usually go unnoticed. There were no flashing lights, no sudden collapse on stage or highway wreck to blame. Terrell Kibble, husband of Karima Kibble from the celebrated gospel trio Virtue, was simply at home when everything changed. The tragedy wasn't loud or public. It was sudden, private, and unbearably intimate. One moment he was there, breathing, living, planning the next chapter of a life built around faith, music, and family. The next, he was gone. Terrell had always been the quieter presence beside Karima's spotlight. A supportive husband, a devoted father, a man known in gospel circles for his kindness rather than fame. Virtue fans knew his name mostly through Karima's proud and joyful mentions during interviews, where she spoke of their marriage with warmth and gratitude. There were no rumors swirling around him, no scandals, no hints of storm clouds gathering in the background. When news of his passing emerged in 2013, it didn't come attached to headlines or controversies. It arrived like a whisper followed by a scream. He died suddenly. No sensational cause released, no drawn-out medical narrative provided. Just shock, followed by a silence that echoed through the gospel community. What made Terrell's death especially heartbreaking is that it blindsided not just friends and fans, but Karima herself. Since Virtue's music often dealt with encouragement, perseverance, and the hidden struggles behind faith, Terrell's passing instantly transformed those lyrics into lived reality. When Karima appeared at his funeral service surrounded by fellow gospel artists, worship leaders, and family members, the grief in the room revealed how deeply he was loved. It wasn't the loss of a celebrity name. It was the loss of a foundation, a husband, a protector, a friend. Gospel singers who had shared stages and hotel lobbies with the Kib Beasts sobbed openly, because this was not a tragedy designed for television or breaking news alerts. It was a quiet hole torn in someone's home. Fans would later say that suddenly Virtue's music sounded different after Terrell's passing. Lyrics about God holding you when you fall or the kind of faith that survives the unexplainable took on heavier meaning. Karima stepped away from public life for long stretches, not because of scandal or controversy, but because grief rarely follows a schedule. She later spoke in interviews about learning how to worship while devastated, how to raise children while grieving, and how to keep singing when every song reminded her of someone who wasn't there anymore. In the aftermath, gospel circles didn't debate medical reports or demand full explanations. They gathered around the family the way church communities are supposed to, with meals, prayers, fundraisers, and silent presence. Terrell's death didn't become a national headline, but it became a personal earthquake for those who knew him, and it forced fans to confront a truth often hidden behind stage lights and rehearsed harmonies. Gospel artists grieve in real homes, not just on stages. Terrell Kibble's story isn't marked by spectacle, scandal, or controversy. It is marked by love, sudden loss, and the weight of absence that never fully lifts. He died in the one place that should have been safest, his home. And sometimes, That is where the deepest tragedies happen. Case 8. Troy Sneed. Troy Sneed spent a lifetime in gospel music creating songs of hope, revival, and spiritual comfort for weary hearts. He was a Florida native whose warm voice and soulful production style helped shape modern praise and worship sounds long before his name was widely recognized. But in April 2020, at the height of the pandemic, his story took a sharp, devastating turn. He wasn't traveling, wasn't preaching, wasn't on tour. He was simply in a Florida hospital room, fighting for breath, while a virus none of us fully understood swept through the world and suffocated industries, families, and entire communities one by one. Troy wasn't one of the older legends whose deaths we sometimes brace ourselves for. He was in his early 50s, still active, still planning projects, still collaborating with choirs and vocalists across the country. That's what made the news hit so hard. There was no headline performance, no final recording session, no farewell concert. There was only a medical emergency, isolation behind hospital glass, and nationwide prayers that ultimately couldn't stop what was coming. The beginning of his battle was largely kept private. At first, the public only saw whispers of concern online, fans asking if rumors were true, musicians posting praying for a brother in the industry, and family members urging supporters to believe for healing. But by the time the truth reached major gospel news outlets, COVID restrictions were still in their strictest phase. The very communities he once united in worship were now divided by distance, unable to gather, unable to lay hands, unable to be present in the room where he lay fighting. There were no choir members filling a waiting room with hymns, no all-night prayer meeting in a church sanctuary. Instead, pastors and singers who had worked with him for decades prayed through screens, posted worship clips in his honor, and asked for miracles inside a hospital unit that allowed no visitors. Just days later, on April 27, 2020, the news arrived that everyone feared. Troy Sneed had died from COVID-19 complications. The announcement came quietly, without any grand ceremony or public statement from a stage, simply a family confirmation and a wave of stunned reactions from fans and colleagues, and suddenly reality hit. One of gospel's most consistent, dependable voices was gone, taken not by scandal, illness, or accident, but by a pandemic that silenced countless lives in isolation. For many, Troy's death was the moment the gospel industry realized the virus wasn't just out there, it was here, it was personal. It could reach into a musician's home studio just as easily as it could strike a stranger on a city bus. In the days that followed, tributes poured in from across the nation. Choirs posted old studio footage, singers shared unreleased voice memos, and rehearsal clips where Troy laughed, directed harmonies, or encouraged a shy vocalist to give it all you've got. Those who knew him talked less about awards and more about character. To them, he wasn't just a producer or singer, he was a mentor, a bridge builder, a brother in ministry. He didn't chase celebrity moments. He built spaces where other voices could shine. What made his loss feel especially cruel was the absence of closure. There was no packed funeral with hundreds of singers lifting a final chorus, no citywide musical tribute, no farewell moment where his peers could gather shoulder to celebrate his life and legacy. Social distancing forced mourning behind screens. Yet even in that fractured moment, one truth became clear. Troy Sneed left behind music that still ministers, still comforts, still moves people to worship, long after the day he took his final breath. In the end, Troy wasn't remembered for the way he died, but for the sound he spent his life giving to others. A voice that once filled arenas and church sanctuaries was silenced quietly in a hospital room. But the songs, the spirit, and the compassion he brought to gospel music remain untouched, echoing through every choir and believer he ever inspired. Case 9. Edwin Hawkins. Edwin Hawkins spent his final days at home in the Bay Area, surrounded not by crowds, cameras, or roaring praise teams, but by hospice nurses, soft voices, and family protecting his peace. The man who changed gospel music forever with one song, a simple youth choir arrangement that unexpectedly swept across continents, was quietly slipping away from pancreatic cancer. There was no dramatic onstage collapse or tragic accident. Instead, there was the quiet, heartbreaking reality of a legend's light slowly dimming in a home filled with memories of choirs, awards, and the unmistakable sound of thousands singing "Oh Happy Day." Where he was when it happened mattered, because Edwin Hawkins wasn't in a hospital ICU surrounded by machines. He chose to be in a familiar space. Close to the Bay Area gospel community he helped build from the ground up. His condition was not a shock to those nearest to him. News of his illness had begun circulating through industry whispers months earlier, but to fans around the world, especially those who only knew him by that one timeless record, the announcement that he had entered hospice hit like a sudden thunderbolt. Hospice meant he wasn't coming back. It meant gospel was preparing to say goodbye to one of its architects. Hawkins' rise was the definition of accidental genius. In 1967, he and a community youth choir recorded "Oh Happy Day" in a church basement as a fundraiser project, never imagining that it would become one of the most influential gospel tracks in history. The song exploded internationally, crossed over into mainstream pop charts, won a Grammy, and permanently changed how the world heard gospel music. And yet, the man behind the revolution never acted like a celebrity. He stayed rooted in Oakland, in his choir, in sound, harmony, and spirit. He created more records, influenced countless artists, and became a spiritual father to multiple generations of praise leaders. But behind the applause and historical impact, his body was quietly failing. Pancreatic cancer is one of the most ruthless illnesses in medicine. Fast, aggressive, and often silent until it's too late. Hawkins endured it with grace. Friends later said he remained soft-spoken, still encouraging people, still asking about music, even as pain began to dictate the rhythm of his days. There was no media spectacle. He didn't attempt a final tour or dramatic farewell statement. Instead, there was stillness, a man preparing for transition with dignity. When word finally spread on January 15, 2018, that Edwin Hawkins had passed, tributes poured in from every corner of gospel. Choir directors, mainstream artists, historians, and everyday listeners all said the same thing: he changed everything. It wasn't just the music, it was the atmosphere. He made worship accessible to the world. He gave gospel a sound that could sit beside soul, R&B, and pop without sacrificing the message. His death marked the end of an era. What makes this case tragic isn't scandal, sudden disaster, or controversy. It's the quiet, unavoidable heartbreak of watching someone who gave so much joy fade away in private pain. Edwin Hawkins died at home, because even legends deserve peace. And in the gospel community, his passing still raises a question that lingers long after the music stops. How is it that one song can outlive the person who wrote it, echoing in churches and hearts, decades after the voice behind it has gone silent? Case 10. Mahalia Jackson. On a cold January morning in 1972, the halls of a Chicago hospital were quiet. Nurses moved from room to room on their early rounds. Outside, the city carried on, unaware that one of the most influential gospel voices in history was taking her final breaths. Mahalia Jackson, the woman whose voice had filled church basements, Carnegie Hall, and the steps of the Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington, was lying in a hospital bed with heart failure and diabetic complications. She had been planning future concerts, dictating letters, talking about new recordings, and promising to return home soon. But her body had finally given out, and in that quiet hospital room, the Queen of Gospel slipped away. The tragedy of Mahalia Jackson's death doesn't come from sensational details or dramatic catastrophes. It comes from the relentless, unseen toll of decades spent pouring her voice into the world. Born in New Orleans in 1911, she grew up in poverty, raised in a community where gospel music was more than a sound, it was survival. By the time she reached adulthood, her voice was unmatched and wasn't simply beautiful, it was commanding. Warm, powerful, unmistakable. She could turn a simple hymn into a spiritual earthquake. Audiences who heard her described feeling lifted, shaken, transformed. And for years, Mahalia carried that weight willingly, singing through exhaustion, illness, and long travel schedules, because she believed her calling was bigger than her suffering. What changed the course of American music forever was the way her voice intersected with history. She didn't just sing, she marched. She performed at rallies, stood beside Martin Luther King Jr., and sang "Precious Lord, Take My Hand" before his final speech in Memphis. In the darkest moments of the civil rights movement, it was Mahalia's voice that gave strength. The world knew her as a singer, but those close to her knew she was also a fighter, someone who carried trauma, stress, and relentless expectations. Decades of touring, traveling, and pushing her body caught up with her. Diabetes worsened, heart problems crept in. She was hospitalized again and again, still thinking about the next performance, the next church, the next audience who needed encouragement. In January 1972, she entered the hospital once more, believing she would recover. Family members and close friends visited her bedside. She spoke softly, still planning for the future, still holding on to the belief that she would sing again. But her immune system was failing. Complications stacked up. On January 27, Mahalia Jackson died at age 60. There was no sudden crash, no breaking news shock, just a devastating quiet. A silence where music used to live. When word spread, the grief was overwhelming. Newspapers across America printed tributes. Gospel stations played marathon broadcasts of her recordings. Civil rights leaders and musicians from every genre paused to honor her. Funeral crowds stretched for blocks. New Orleans held a homegoing celebration that felt like a national Sunday service. People described her passing as losing the soundtrack of hope. Thousands had never met her, but they felt like she guided them through heartbreak and injustice. Mahalia Jackson's death reminds us that tragedy isn't always violent or dramatic. Sometimes it's slow, hidden, and painfully human. She died in a hospital, surrounded not by cameras or headlines, but by complications that stole her strength, one battle at a time. And yet, even in death, her voice didn't stop echoing. Generations of artists, gospel singers, civil rights activists, and ordinary people still find courage in her recording. The Queen of Gospel may have died quietly in Chicago, but the legacy she left behind is louder and more enduring than ever. When you look back over these stories, there's a common thread that sits at the edge of the stage and never leaves. None of these gospel legends knew the moment when everything would stop. Some were traveling between concerts, still carrying set lists in their pockets. Some were home, finally resting after decades of ministry. Others were in sterile hospital rooms, surrounded by machines, or slipping away quietly while loved ones held their hands. Every life on this list shook the gospel world not just because of death, but because of where it happened. Because the stage lights were still burning, the microphones still set up, the songs still waiting to be sung. Their stories remind us that the voices that lift our spirits can be taken without warning, leaving silence where praise once echoed. Each name we've mentioned left behind more than records and award plaques. They left broken hearts, unfinished plans, and people trying to make sense of sudden loss. And if tonight's documentary taught us anything, it's that legacy isn't made in the final moment, but in the thousands of moments before it. The late-night rehearsals, the battered tour buses, the notebooks full of lyrics and prayers. Tragedy doesn't cancel impact. Silence doesn't erase a song. Now I want to hear from you. Which one of these stories hit you the hardest? Was it a gospel voice you grew up hearing? Was it a death that came out of nowhere? Or did one of these locations, a highway, a hospital, a home, change the way you think about how quickly everything can end? Drop your thoughts, reactions, and memories in the comments section. Your voice matters here. And before you go, make sure you subscribe to Savage Case Files. Your support keeps documentaries like this alive every single day, carefully researched, respectfully told, and delivered straight to you. If you love true crime, real stories, and deep dives into the hidden corners of history, hit that subscribe button right now. We'll be back with another investigation soon.